thing I remember knowing was a lonesome whistle blowing and a youngin's dream of growing up to ride on a freight train leaving town, not knowing where I'm bound. No one could change my mind. Mama tried. One and only rebel child from a family meek and mild, my mama seemed to know what lay in store. Despite all my Sunday learning, with the bad I kept on turning till mama couldn't hold me anymore. And I turned 21 in prison, doing life without parole. No one could steer me right, but mama tried, mama tried, mama tried to raise me better. But her pleading I denied. That leaves only me to blame, 'cause mama tried. Dear old daddy, rest his soul, left my mom a heavy load. She tried so very hard to fill his shoes, working hours without rest, wanted me to have the best. She tried to raise me right, but I refused. And I turned 21 in prison, doing life without parole. No one could steer me right, but mama tried, mama tried, mama tried to raise me better. But her pleading I denied. That leaves only me to blame, 'cause mama tried.
In his book on boundaries, the psychologist Henry Townsend told about a couple who came into his office for counseling. He asked, "Why are you here?" And they said, "Well, we're really here for our son, our 25-year-old son, Bill. Bill has a real problem, but he wouldn't come today because he doesn't believe he has a problem." Now, just parenthesis. Every time I counsel with people as a pastor for the last 20 years, I keep discovering, sadly, over and over, that the people who most need counsel are the most resistant to it. They don't need it. Their wife needs it. Kids need it. Mama needs it. Not them. Bill didn't need it. He didn't have a problem. And so the parents told Dr. Townsend, "Our son does not believe he has a problem." Now let that line stick. Our son does not believe he has a problem. And Townsend said, "Okay, said, tell us his problem." Well, he's 25 years old. He's still bouncing around from college to college. Doesn't know what he wants to do with his life. He lives at home. He's on and off of drugs. Hangs around with a lot of druggies. He's gone to like 4 or 5 different schools, but it just never worked out for him. We think maybe it wasn't the right fit. We put the money there to supply all his needs. We want him to be able to study. We didn't want him to have to work while he was going to college. We wanted him to be able to focus on his studies and his social life. But he either dropped out or just stopped going to class or flunked out. And so each time we would find another college that would fit him better. And so now he just doesn't seem open to changes. He does not realize he has a problem. That's when Dr. Cloud said, "Do you know your son is right? He does not have a problem. He doesn't have a problem in the world. You do. Now, would you like for me to help him get some problems?" Because right now he doesn't have any. He does irresponsible stuff. He thinks nothing about breaking the rules and going against the very people who are trying to help him. He doesn't have a problem. It's a boundary issue. And here's what's got to happen with Bill. We've got to set some boundaries here so that his actions create problems for himself rather than for his parents. And they said, what do you mean by boundaries? And Cloud said, think of it this way. Your son, Bill, is like a next door neighbor, and you got a good sprinkler system in your yard, only it's not set right, because almost all the water sprays over into your neighbor's yard. And the grass over there is bright green and lush, while your grass is choked out and looks like the Dust Bowl. And what you've got to do is set some boundaries and rearrange those sprinklers so that your water falls on your yard. Give him the problem of living on the dirt. And maybe if he lives in the dirt long enough, he'll get tired of it. Need to give him some problems. One last thing Cloud told him. Right now, your son is irresponsible and happy. Irresponsible and happy. You, on the other hand, as parents, you are responsible and miserable. This needs to change. It needs to reverse. But I like that phrase, irresponsible and happy. It perfectly describes the Bible character that I want to talk to you about this morning. His name was Samson. Now, Samson's story started just like all of our stories. It started with God and with his mama, who was determined to try. And let's read about the beginning of Samson's life, what his life was supposed to be like, who God made him to be, what God intended him to do. You see, Samson was arguably the most powerful man in the Old Testament. Obviously in terms of physical strength, but I just mean in general. He was one of the most powerful men in the Old Testament, but he did the absolute worst job in the Old Testament of managing that power. His power was completely out of control. It was like putting a 16-year-old behind the wheels of a Ferrari and turning him loose on Highway 8 East. No responsibility, we'll buy the gas. Just hit it, son, and have a good time. That's the way Samson lived his life. No boundaries. Although God intended for there to be some boundaries in his life. And here in this passage, Judges 13, 3-5, we're given a glimpse at what those were. Chapter 13, verse 3 and 5. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, even though you've been unable to have children, you will soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. So be careful. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden food. You will become pregnant, give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut, for he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. And this next line tells you what God has in mind for this child to do. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines. That's his life purpose. We all got different purposes. This was his. Begin the process of throwing off the oppression of the Philistines. He was given this instruction to live by a Nazirite vow. And the most famous part of that Nazirite vow business is the hair. You never cut it. And there were some other Bible characters who took that same vow. For example, the prophet Samuel, Elijah, and John the Baptist. They were Nazirites too. And they were also very powerful, very influential. The difference is they knew where the boundaries were. They managed to keep their Ferrari between the ditches. And they really went places. And they made a huge positive difference in the world around them. Samson, man, he broke every rule Mama ever tried to teach him. And then some that she had never even thought of. He broke them all. And he had this power that was just out of control. But, you know, even the broken clock's right twice a day. Anybody's going to do something good every now and then. He did once have a great victory over the Philistines. He had the power to take a lion by the jaws and rip him apart. I'm not recommending that. I'm just saying. He had a whole lot of potential. And from the time he was little, he was told, this is why you're here. This is why you're here. This is why you're here. You are to begin delivering your people from Philistine oppression. Problem was, Samson had this fondness for Philistine women, especially loose Philistine women. Oh, he just couldn't keep his hands off them. And his very first wife was a Philistine girl. Chapter 14 tells how he found this Philistine girl, told his parents. They said, well, what's this about? Don't you need to marry someone of your own kind? Someone from among our tribe? A fellow Israelite knows the same God? You know what Samson's reply was? Get her for me. She looks good. Look it up. She looks good. So, Mama tried. Daddy tried. But in spite of all Samson's Sabbath learning, toward the bad he kept on turning. Till Mama couldn't hold him anymore. And so it's no surprise that he eventually wound up in a very dangerous spot that unfolded in a way that surprised Samson. But for the rest of us, we could almost guess something like this was going to happen. I'm talking about Judges 16, verse 4 and 5. And it came to pass afterward that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said unto her, entice him, and see wherein his great strength lies, by what means we may prevail against him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and we will give thee, every one of us, 1,100 pieces of silver. So, Delilah began her sneaky, seductive task of finding the secret of his strength. And all of this led to a humiliating defeat for Samson. How that happened and why and the details, that's a sermon in itself. But she defeated a very strong man with her mind and with her body. She defeated him. But it does make you wonder, when she began to ask him over and over and over, what's the secret of your strength? And she just won't leave it alone. And He'd been taught all his life, this is private stuff. What was he thinking to keep hanging out with this woman? To keep allowing her to reel him in closer and closer to the net? I don't know what he was thinking, but he does remind me of two old boys I read about this week. They decided they wanted to get into the trucking business. I think their names were Dumb and Dumber. And on their very first run, they saw a sign on the roadside that said, "Tunnel ahead, clearance, 11-foot 2." So they pulled over. Got to thinking, well, we might ought to make sure our height is below 11.2. And so they measured it. They were 11.9. But Dumb looked around and he turned to Dumber and said, "I don't see any cops. Let's go for it." Do you know some sins carry their own punishment? The consequences start rolling anytime we do something good or bad. When we say something good or something bad, it has a ripple effect. The difference about Dumb and Dumber and Samson is that in most cases, the bad and the good stuff we do, those seeds we plant, take a long time to really grow. But in Samson's case, it happened quick. The Bible says in Judges 16, verse 21, "So the Philistines captured him and gouged out his eyes. They took him to Gaza, where he was bound with bronze chains and forced to grind grain in the prison." You ever got anything in your eye before? Samson got something in his eye. They blinded him. They gave him the job that an ox would normally do, pushing round and round. I think we've got a picture that'll give you the idea. Pushing round and around, doing the work of an ox, grinding grain. Samson did that over and over and over. And this appeared to be the end of Samson's story. And my, what a sad ending to such a glad beginning. Only whenever it's God's story, when God's involved in the story, what appears to be the ending is usually not. Often, what appears to be the end is actually a spot where a new beginning is going to happen. That is what happened with Samson. Tied, yoked to that mule, blind, just moving forward, not knowing where he was going, where this was all going to end. The Bible tells us something very encouraging. It's chapter 16, verse 22. "But before long, howbeit, the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven." Everybody thought Samson was done for. Everybody but God. And Samson grinding round and round and round. One day he felt something on the back of his neck. He slapped it off. And after 2 or 3 more turns around that mill, he felt it again and slapped it off again. Is that a moth, a horsefly? What is that? And then he felt it. My hair, it's growing again. It's growing again. And down in that low place, Samson started growing again. Samson and God started really going places in their relationship with one another. Yeah, he was stuck in a place he did not want to be, and he was going round and round in circles, blind. But Samson was traveling within. Inside, stuff was changing. He found himself in the same position as that prodigal son Jesus talked about, who was finally starving and broke, living in filth. But finally, the Bible says he came to himself. You ever given much thought to that? He came to himself. The prodigal came to himself. Samson came to himself. You know what that means? They came to their true selves. The true self that God had made way back in the beginning. The true self, the image of God in them. But that self had been covered in gunk and asphalt, but it was there. And as he came to himself and he began remembering who he was supposed to be and who he could have been, and he began to wonder, what might I still be able to do? And all the layers of arrogance and defiance and that big honking ego was cut away as his hair began to grow again and his relationship with God began to grow again. Remember that 25-year-old Bill? Let us help you help him have some problems. Well, now Samson, for the first time in his life, had problems. And nobody came to the rescue. Mama couldn't help. God didn't help. Because God knew Samson was right where he needed to be. Samson had problems. But behind those blind eyes, lights came on in his brain. And he started seeing things in a new way. He started seeing his mistakes, and he started seeing what he'd done wrong and where he'd gone wrong. And Samson came to himself. He asked God's forgiveness. He basically admitted what Merle Haggard did. They all tried, but it leaves only me to blame. Listen, until a person gets to the point where they can look you in the eye and say, I am to blame. I was wrong. So they can do that without making excuses, without blaming anybody else. They're just going to keep going in circles. Don't help that kind of person. Don't take away their problems. He was harnessed to that yoke. And Jesus talked about a yoke. Jesus talked about it in Matthew 11, 29 and 30. And what Jesus said is something that I never understood until recently. He said, come, you who got heavy burdens, and join me, get yoked in with me, for my yoke is light and my burden is easy. What was that all about? Well, see, an ox was built for two, not one. Samson was trying to pull it all by himself and go in all the wrong places. But here's the way it worked. In those old days, you would take a young ox, a strong ox, a young bull ox, and you'd hook him with a bigger, older, wiser ox. And they would begin to go down the row in the field. And that young ox would yank and twist and twirl, but the harder he fought it, the more worn out he became. And it wore him down to a frazzle, fighting the predicament that he really needed to be in. But when the ox or the man, or the woman, or the boy, finally surrenders, he discovers that the other ox does most of the pulling. And if you've been walking with Christ for long, you know that it's not an easy way, this narrow road that leads to life. It's not an easy way, but he does most of the pulling. And he can always pull you out of places you'd never get out of on your own. Samson got yoked together with God. Hair, strength, it grew and it grew and it grew. It grew until the power of God rippled through his muscles. And on that day, when the Philistines brought him into their temple to make sport, to torture him, and then to kill him, they didn't notice the hair that was growing again. They knew nothing of the God who was now alive and active in every sinew of Samson's body. And you know the rest of the story. It was a tremendous victory for Samson. The greatest victory of Samson's life came at the very end of his life. Could have been different, could have been a whole lot better, but it just shows that no matter how far gone we are, God is still trying. God's still trying. He's still trying with everybody in this place. And what we've got to do is come to ourselves, acknowledge who we are. I've sinned. I've gone the wrong way. But I want to hook up with you, Lord, and move forward in the direction you've already chosen.